Hello, everybody. Back with Patty Reed's doll, Chapter 14, The Salt Desert. We toiled up the rough mountain range 1,000 feet above the valley, and when we came to the top of the pass and looked out over the desert that lay ahead of us, even my wooden heart trembled at the sight. Under the noonday heat glittered a dazzling white desert, a desert of salt, they said. "Good heavens, James!" Uncle George Donner exclaimed to Mr. Reed. "Anyone can see that stretches more than 40 miles. We camped at the foot of the mountain that night, but there was no water to be had. The thirsty oxen were each given a quart from the shrinking supply that the men had stored back at the springs. As a great white moon rose to take the place of the burning sun, a chill wind cooled the hot atmosphere, and gloomy and shivering, the folks fell wearily into their beds. Mrs. Reed hugged the little boys close as she tried to soothe their whimperings, and she told them everything would be all right. Even Lively Puss seemed sober as she said to Patty, "It scares me to see Papa look so worried." Patty answered, "It is so awfully lonely here," and her hand slipped under the pillow and clutched me to make sure that we two had each other still. The 2 days and 2 nights passed, and yet we did not come to the end of that awful desert. The water gave out completely, and there were no more grass for the oxen. They dragged haltingly along in the hot September sun until they could go no further. Some of them lay down and refused to move. The children cried for water, and their mother gave them lumps of sugar to cool their hot mouths. The wagons became separated, every family urging its cattle on as fast as possible. Once in the glimmering heat waves, we thought we saw a green, cool spot ahead. "Water!" Milk called out and tried to urge the oxen on faster. As we watched, the vision of waving grass and trees receded, and Puss's voice cracked as she turned to her mother, and said, "It's only a mirage." The girls and their mother had been walking beside the drooping oxen, and Mr. Reed was leading Glaucus, reluctant to put any strain on the poor beast. Finally, he said, "Margaret, I'm going to ride ahead and find water. Glaucus will make it, and we've got to save the cattle. Our lives depend on theirs, and our wagons are too heavy for them to pull much further. Most of the other folks are a long ways ahead of us." She instructed the teamsters, Milton Bayliss, Walter Heron, and Noah Smith, to keep the animals moving, and mounting Glaucus, he galloped away to the west. The children and their mother trudged on. When Tommy and Jimmy grew too tired to keep up, Milt hoisted them into the palace car. In the close, hot cradle of Patty's pocket, I felt as though my painted face was melting, and I wondered how my sister dolls were faring in their box in the wagon. "Mother, my eyes burn so," Patty said. "I know, darling. Close them and take my hand," her mother told her. "Do you think the Donners have found water yet?" Puss asked. "I hope so, Puss. If they have, we can't be too far off." Poor Billy, he looked thirstier than we do, and little Cash and the other dogs. "Look how they are panting. I hope Papa gets back before night," Puss said. The deep sand made walking difficult. I could tell that we weren't making much headway. The afternoon shadows lengthened across the desolate waste, and still Mr. Reed did not return. Eliza took out some of the cornbread she had baked before we started across the desert. The children munched it unhappily. "It's so dry, Mommy," Jimmy complained. "Can't I have some milk?" "The milk is all gone, Jimmy," his mother tried to explain. "Papa will come back soon with water. Eat the Johnny cake like a good boy, and I'll give you a lump of sugar to hold in your mouth." Finally, the darkness came, and with it the relief from the scorching heat. When the moon rose, white and still, Patty said, "How can it be so quiet? It feels as though we are at the end of nowhere. Nothing can live in this awful place. No birds, no animals, not even mosquitoes. Ugh, why did we ever start for California? Springfield was so nice, Puss said bitterly. We didn't know it would be like this, her mother answered. Mrs. Donner was right. We should never have left the old road. Milt walked over to say that he and Smith had decided to unyoke the oxen and lead them ahead to water. They were ready to give out, Mrs. Reed. We're afraid they won't last till morning unless they get a drink. Walter and Bayless will stay here with you. If we're lucky, we'll meet Mr. Reed a ways out. Patty's mother told him to do what he thought was best. Then she and the children and Eliza climbed into the palace car and tried to sleep. No one said much. They seemed to have only one thought. When will Papa be back? At dawn he arrived, with water, but with bad news also. It was still a long, long way across the desert. The other families were struggling to get there. Only the Eddies had finally reached the spring at the edge of the salt flats. I met Milt and Smith about 10 o'clock. They were 10 miles from water then. We'll wait here until they return, he said. All the next day, Mr. Reed impatiently scanned the horizon for signs of the teamsters and the oxen. They didn't come. At sundown, he decided that the only thing to do was to pack as much food as they could carry and the rest of the water and start out on foot to overtake some of the other wagons. After resting all day, the family was anxious to go. Anything was better than this terrible waiting. Margaret, I never thought I'd bring you to such a pass as this, Patty's father said to his wife as they dragged along through the sand. I know, James, she answered. If we had foreseen it, it wouldn't have happened. Now all we can do is be brave and hope for the best. It wasn't long before the short legs of the little boys gave out in the deep sand. Their mother took one in her arms and their father in the other, and they all walked on in the ghostly moonlight. After a while, I could tell that Patty was getting tired. She moved more and more slowly, stumbling often, and finally she fell to the ground. Puss helped her up, and she groaned, Papa, I'm so tired. Can't we stop and rest a little? Her father spread down a blanket he was carrying, and the family gathered onto it. A cold wind was blowing, and the shawls he covered them with were hardly enough to keep them warm. After suffering from the heat all day, it seemed especially grim that they should have to suffer from the cold at night. Their mother and father tried to shelter them by sitting with their own backs to the wind, and calling the family dogs, Mr. Reed ordered them to lie down next to the children. Their warm bodies helped some, and soon they were asleep, the dogs, the children, and the parents all huddled in one heap on the cold sands. They slept for only a short time, however. Suddenly, one of the dogs leaped up barking, and in a moment all of them had dashed off into the night as if to attack some danger. Patty's father pulled out his pistol as a large animal came charging through the darkness. The dogs headed it off, and Mr. Reed exclaimed, I was sure it was one of our own oxen. The animal must have gone mad with thirst. This frightened the children, and they too jumped up and began to run. Their parents had difficulty calming them down. Let's hurry on, Patty quavered. I'm not tired any more. For the rest of the night we kept moving, and at last, about daylight, we came up to the wagons of Uncle Jacob Donner. They told us we must wait there with them. It was too far to walk to water, and the men would be back with their oxen soon. Patty's father borrowed a horse and went on to see what had become of our teamsters and cattle, and all day we rested with the Donners. In the evening, the men returned with their oxen and yoked them to the wagons and pulled us all to the spring. I shall never forget how the children dipped first their hands and then their faces into the cool wetness. Their mothers cautioned them not to drink too much at once, so they just knelt down there in the grass and touched it. Our troubles were far from over, though. Only one ox and one cow belonging to the Reeds were there at the spring. Patty's father was out hunting the rest, and some of the men said they had all broken loose from our teamsters and stampeded away into the night before they got to water. For several days we camped at the spring while the men searched for the cattle. Mr. Donner drove his teams back over the desert and brought our wagons in. And there they stood with no teams to pull them on. Other families had lost oxen too. Most of them lay dead of exhaustion on the salt desert. Some had disappeared into the night like the reed cattle. There were Indians about, and not a few of the folks thought that the Indians knew more about what had become of the animals than we did. Finally, they gave up all hope of recovering them, and it was decided that we must move on. On the final evening before breaking camp, Patty's father sat on the step of the wagon, his head in his hands, looking more unhappy than we had ever seen him before. We started out with so much, more than enough to see us safely through, and now we have nothing. We'll have to abandon the wagons and divide our provisions among those who will give us passage in theirs, he said. We'll manage, James, his wife replied, her arm around his stooping shoulders. On the other side of the mountains is California, and we'll get there somehow. The next morning, all of our provisions were transferred to other people's wagons. Patty's mother took out a change of clothes for each member of the family, and the rest was stored away in the palace car to be buried in the desert. But I can't leave my dolls out there for Indians to capture, Patty cried. I'll carry them myself all the way to California. My child, you'll have all you can do to carry your own little self. Patty cried brokenheartedly to think of her beautiful doll family buried out there in the sand. If everything goes well, her mother tried to console her, we'll come back and get them. Patty bent down to pick up a little glass doll dish and a play knife and fork and spoon that were lying on a trash heap next to the wagon. Just at that moment, I fell out of her pocket. I confess, I thought the end had come. I too would be buried in the dust of the desert. But I lay there only for an instant. Patty snatched me up quickly and hid me in the lining of her waist, fearing, I suppose, that should her mother know she had me, I too would be taken away from her. From then on, I could not see what was going on. I listened as hard as I could from beneath the folds of Patty's waist where I was hidden and pieced together snatches of conversations that would let me know what was happening to the family. Once in a while, when no one was about, Patty's hand came up and pressed me to her heart as she whispered some words of affection to let me know that she hadn't forgotten I was there. I gathered from remarks I heard that one of our wagons still remained to us. Mr. Breen and Mr. Eddy each lent us an ox, and we traveled along with the party in that way. The salt desert had been crossed, and there seemed to be plenty of water now. And that is the end of chapter 14. Check back tomorrow and we will read chapter 15, Along the Marys River. Until then, see you later.